Heat pressed into the Honouliuli Gulch like a wet wool blanket that wouldn't lift. Corrugated roofs shimmered, and the barbed wire hummed a single metallic note. At 1200 hours on the 12th of March 1944, Sergeant William Red Calhoun, Army Service Forces, Mess Section, leaned into the gasoline breath of a range field M1937. The burner's low roar sounded like a ship's boiler. He slid a perforated turner under patties and flipped. Fat met steel and sang while onions sweated down to sweetness. The stove wanted fuel and attention. Give it both, and it turned gasoline into morale. He'd counted the day into trays: ground beef in 50-pound bricks, onions by the score, flour sacks with yesterday's Pearl Harbor Depot stamp. At dawn, a GMC CCKW 2.5 had nosed through the red mud with the load. 5,000-pound off-road rating, straight-six engine, range enough to circle Oahu twice and still idle to a halt inside the fence. Cases of glass rode in the truck's slatted coffins, bottles chiming softly, cold clinging to them like an order not to be disobeyed. They sweated now in the shade. Rumour ran ahead of the chow line, Red Cross eyes today. That meant no flourish and no shortcuts, only the book. Geneva, Article 11, as flat as a mess table, rations for prisoners equivalent in quantity and quality to depot troops. Red kept the line posted on the inside of his skull. Equal coffee, equal meat, equal bread, equal salt. He didn't quote it. He practiced it the way a rifleman practices sight picture until it lives in the hands. The guard detail came up the path with a work party in tow, Japanese nationals in sun-bleached shirts, small cloth squares stitched to collars like second names. Among them walked Takako Ishii, 26, a schoolteacher by training, now a civilian internee assigned to laundry. Eyes on the dust, back straight out of habit, she breathed in smoke and onion. She had been taught Americans were soft and savage, loud and undisciplined. The odour rising off Red's range contradicted her lessons. Fat on hot steel is its own language. "Watch spacing," Red told his cooks. "Gloves on the bum box. Door stays shut unless you're pulling." He tuned the burner by ear until the flame settled into a contented growl. On the side rack, a kettle pushed coffee toward a rolling tremor, black as harbour water at night. 2 sheet pans slid into the oven compartment to warm buns. Steam would loosen the crumb just enough to cushion salt and char. A ladle's handle clinked against tin. Somewhere a fly smacked into wire and fell away. Private First Class Daniel Sato of the Military Intelligence Service crossed the yard with a clipboard, walking between dust eddies like a man who practiced not being noticed. Hilo-born, English and Japanese braided clean in his mouth, he carried orders you couldn't print, listen to what hunger does to voices. After hot meals, statements that choke in a bare room sometimes step forward of their own accord. He paused at the canteen cage where a corporal tallied stock, tobacco, candy, stationery, soft drinks, and thought about how mercy, correctly measured, turns into information. The line formed. The guard sergeant tipped his brim. "Civilians first, Sergeant, then the POW compound." Red nodded and lifted the first patty. The turner's holes stamped a constellation in the crust. The smell moved through the yard like a parade. Takako reached the table. Shadow from the bottle crate crossed her sandals. A cap came off with a sharp sigh. The bottle hissed like a small surf break finding its beach. She accepted bun, meat and glass with both hands, as if the act itself demanded ceremony. She had never held bread that yielded under her fingers. She put the meat inside and closed it as she had seen in magazines and posters, a gesture copied from a world that used to be far away. Her bite brought salt, smoke, and a softness that belonged to the bread. Something pricked behind her eyes, and she told herself it was the steam. The bottle was colder than the valley. Bubbles climbed her tongue and startled her nose until she almost laughed, almost. The laugh stayed where training kept it. Sato watched like a codebreaker seeing a new cipher give up a pattern. He marked the time, the look, the second sip. In training, they had discussed honour and shame, the doctrine that told Japanese sailors and soldiers surrender was a second death. No one had mentioned what sugar could do to a story told since boyhood. He folded the clipboard against his ribs and waited for voices to loosen. Across the yard, a naval officer, Lieutenant Commander Shigeru Tanaka, hollow-cheeked and precise, counted the choreography. Crates, fuel cans, clipboards, trucks backing to the kitchen door with the casual certainty of a routine perfected. He took it in without moving his lips, adding an unwanted column. The gulch felt like the inside of a clock. He tried not to hear the ticking. Red flipped another row, and another. He worked the range as a gun crew works a piece. Clean motion, heat discipline, no wasted talk. He wasn't thinking about doctrine or the Red Cross. He was thinking about the promise his country had written down and handed to him to keep. Equal coffee, equal meat, equal bread. The wire stopped humming for a heartbeat, as if the whole camp waited for the next order. Somewhere a cap hissed free again, and the world shifted a half-inch on its rails. Sato liked to map sound before he chased meaning. This place spoke in registers, the M1937's basso growl, metal spatulas tapping pan rims in impatient rhythm, the glassy clink of bottles settling in their crates, the staccato of boots on gravel, the constant testing buzz of flies. He plotted those notes like a radio man shaping static into speech. When he wrote, he dated the page, 12th of March 1944, Honouliuli, and the hour, 12:09, because timestamps make patterns honest. He began with the rule book. Article 11 of the 1929 Geneva Convention was not poetry, yet it read like a creed. Prisoners receive rations equivalent in quantity and quality to depot troops. Sato had copied that language longhand during training, circled equivalent 3 times, and underlined quality because words become weapons when they are enforced consistently. US Army regulations built canteens into the custodial architecture. Inspectors from the International Committee of the Red Cross arrived as predictably as paydays. Soft drinks appeared on approved lists with tobacco and stationery, a mundane fact that said everything about scale. He traced the path from depot to mouth the way his mentors had taught him to trace a rumour from origin to outcome. Pearl Harbor storage yesterday. 2 CCKWs at dawn, one loaded heavy with flour and meat, one riding glass and ice, a guard section to secure the transfer, a mess line to convert fuel into calories. Each step added another proof to the theorem. If the system can spare refrigeration for bottles and spare sugar for enemies, what can it afford for its own? His questions worked better when they were small. He asked about hunger aboard transports, about rice rations measured too carefully, about barley that stretched a meal while thinning a man. He did not ask for secrets, at least not at first. He asked about taste. Men tell truth they do not recognize when they describe mouthfeel and smell. He listened for cadence, for the first unguarded clause, the shrug that means a story is shifting from lesson to memory. Takako sat under a strip of shade and ate in measured bites, keeping her back straight out of a lifetime of discipline. She glanced at the guard's boots, then at the bottle, then away. The carbonation made her eyes water, and she permitted herself to believe the tears belonged to the drink. Sato pretended not to watch. He noted the quiet the mess line imposed. Murmurs, yes, but the kind that come when hands are full and bellies move from doubt toward expectation. He had read camp circulars that treated hot meals as behavior control as much as nutrition. He had also read interrogation summaries where one paragraph's obstinacy melted into the next paragraph's recollection after coffee. He never bullied a witness. He waited for the moment when human need aligned with professional purpose. Mercy, correctly measured, produces information without raising a hand. Across the yard, Red's crew operated like a gun section, loading, firing, swabbing, loading again. Heat curled off the griddle in ripples that made the horizon wobble. The oven compartment exhaled bread scent every time a pan came out, followed by the short, decisive click of a door shut against waste. One of the cooks wiped the steel with a cloth that smelled of grease and soap. A corporal at the canteen cage recited items like a catechism: tobacco, candy, razor blades, stationery, soft drinks. The list sounded like something from a peacetime corner store, and in that incongruity lay the point. Sato stepped close enough to hear the fizz rush a neck after the cap snapped. He thought about the rumour that inspectors would stop by the Sand Island facility later in the week and remembered an earlier report that described 3 abundant meals equal to the best food of the United States Army. Abundant was an unmilitary word and therefore valuable. It named what statistics only suggest when they sit alone on a page. He walked to the POW fence and exchanged courtesies with a petty officer whose uniform had lost its shape to weeks of wear. The man spoke politely, then carefully, then, after Sato said nothing more than "you may finish first," normally. He asked if the American stoves always sounded like that. Sato answered with the model number and said the range would run as long as it had fuel and a man with ears to tune it. The petty officer nodded, not at the stove, but at the implication. By 12:40, the valley's noises had changed timbre. The wire no longer sang with tension. The shade cloths rattled in a tolerable breeze. Red's crew moved like a clock correcting itself. Sato wrote a single line he knew he would use later. When the system feeds enemies by rule, rumour learns a new grammar. He capped his pen, slid the opener back into his pocket, and turned toward the inevitable conversations that begin only after the plates are empty. Takako did not imagine a meal could contradict a lifetime, yet contradiction is what the first bite delivered. Bread that yielded, a patty that bled clear, onions that turned sweet under heat, a bottle cold enough to shock the palm. She was 26 and careful. The camp called her a civilian internee. The word prisoner lived in the corners anyway, no matter what the papers said. The bun steamed against her lip and she thought of schoolroom chalk dust, of her father's quiet hands, of the lesson books that had promised Americans were undisciplined and faithless. The meat was not a promise, it was evidence. A guard gestured her toward a strip of shade. She obeyed because practice is a second skeleton. The wire threw shadows like a net. From somewhere behind the kitchen came the precise double cough of a truck finding reverse. GMCCCKW, she had heard someone say, the syllables making a kind of music. She did not know payloads or engine types. She knew the sound of a system not straining. She took a second sip, and the fizz seemed to sand a layer off old fear. Across the yard, Lieutenant Commander Shigeru Tanaka watched without blinking. Staff habits do not die, even when uniforms fray. He counted crates multiplied by bottles, divided by heads in line, estimated Truck A's interval to Truck B by tyre noise, and the time it took a corporal to sign a manifest. He made war out of arithmetic because arithmetic had once promised victory. The Gulch told him a different sum. An enemy that could afford to be generous on schedule could afford other, harder things. Sato took notes he did not show. He logged the way voices softened into a human key after food, how shoulders settled half an inch, how refusals became delays and delays became answers. He asked small questions. How did the ship's rice taste after the second week? How often did the barley arrive? What number did the quartermaster call enough? He did not write down what he felt watching Takako swallow against sudden sweetness. Feeling was not his job. Precision was. Red did not perform. He worked. He tuned the M1937 by ear, nudged the coffee until it sat at a steady simmer, slid pans so the heat licked but did not scorch. He believed in standards because standards were what stood when storms took everything else. Article 11 was not a suggestion. It was a boundary line that kept decent men decent under pressure. Equal coffee, equal meat, equal bread. He had pinned that list inside his head and hammered it into habit. A breeze lit the valley for a minute. The wire's single note broke into harmony. A cook laughed at nothing, relieved. Somewhere in the canteen cage, a corporal stacked bottles into pyramids, as if neatness could answer fear. Takako finished half the sandwich and put the other half down, not from fullness, but from a need to measure this new thing. The bottle's glass stayed cool. She tipped it and listened as the fizz spoke a language without verbs. Numbers wait until called, then answer with a voice that erases doubt. America's aircraft output would approach 300,000 by war's end. Japan's would hover around 76,000. Somewhere far beyond the gulch, dozens upon dozens of bottling plants had been built so a 5-cent drink could reach any GI anywhere. Those impossible numbers did not live on the yard's gravel, but their shadow did. Bread warm as breath, coffee as dark as harbour water, a stove that never missed a beat. Tanaka's pencil scratched a verdict he did not want. If the enemy can spare sugar and cold for us, he is not close to empty. Takako's second laugh escaped, too small to punish. She looked guilty, and then relieved at her own guilt. The guard, standing nearest, pretended to be interested only in the horizon. Sato wrote the time and closed his book. He would not quote her later, he would quote the inspection phrase, 3 abundant meals, because the bureaucracy accepted the bureaucratic. The human belonged to memory. Red wiped the griddle with a cloth that smelled like work. He slid fresh buns into the oven compartment and glanced at the fuel can. Enough. He tipped his cap an inch at the guard sergeant and received the same iron courtesy back. Discipline travelled both directions across the mess line when men did their jobs. The valley returned to its hum, but the pitch had changed. Takako looked at the bottle cap in her palm, a small tin circle impressed with a starburst she did not recognize. She closed her fist around it like a charm. Tanaka folded his calculations until the paper hid inside his boot. Sato moved toward the fence, hearing in the day's ordinary noises the beginning of confessions nobody planned to make. The stove breathed on. The hour did not end so much as turn a corner with the quiet decisiveness of a truck shifting up. The M1937 breathed like a tame dragon when it was properly tuned. Red ran his knuckles along the control panel as if reading Braille, then cracked the valve until the flame's pitch settled into a confident growl. He briefed his crew with the same economy an artillery chief uses when laying a piece: posture, spacing, handoff, eye contact. He did not sermonize about conscience. He posted the rule in motions. Article 11 lived in the length of a ladle paw and the weight of meat distributed evenly across a tray. He separated the work into lanes. Burner 1 seared patties. 2 held coffee at the exact point where bitterness quit and strength began. Oven compartment warmed pans of buns until steam made every crumb forgiving. He lined the perforated turners on a towel, holes clean so grease would drain instead of pool, because small physics made big differences when you were feeding hundreds. A private from Kansas kept time with a light tap on steel, a metronome that kept the line honest. Sato hovered at a polite distance, noting what the stove did as much as what the men said. He liked that the range had a designation, M1937, because names and numbers meant somebody had cared enough to solve problems before they hurt soldiers. The field manual explained the jets and burners in spare diagrams. Red translated the diagrams into behaviour. Low hiss means richness, hard roar means waste. Coffee sings when it's right. When Sato finally asked how you knew, Red shrugged. You listen, then you listen again. The canteen cage opened for rationed business. A corporal in a clean apron checked requisitions, his list as unromantic as an invoice. Tobacco, candy, razor blades, stationery, soft drinks. Soft drinks. The phrase still looked like a civilian intruder until Sato remembered why it belonged. The United States built compliance into its custody. A camp that sold soda by rule was not showing off. It was signalling doctrine up and down the chain, across oceans and into enemy rumour mills. He followed the link backward. Pearl Harbor depots, truck loading areas, ice houses that drank electricity, ship manifests, until the line became a sketch of the war itself, industry-shaping behaviour far from factory floors. The Sand Island inspection reports he'd read last month had used the word abundant with the matter-of-fact chill of bureaucratic prose. He preferred the stove's proof to paperwork. The oven door opened. Bread smell rolled out like a memory. The door shut with a precise, conserving click. Tanaka watched from the fence with a staff officer's fatal patience. His gaze took in the redundancy built into the system. If one truck slipped in the mud, another winched it free. If one cook missed the turn, another nudged the line back to tempo. Every component assumed a partner component existed and was ready. He recognized the logic because once he had hoped to command it. Scarcity had taught him to plan around emptiness. Here, the plan bent toward fullness. Red rotated crews without losing rhythm, gloves on, trays up, trays down. He checked the fuel cans and called for one fresh and one half, because you never broke the line's breath by running a tank dry. He took a moment to wipe a smear of soot from a control face and thought about his first kitchen in uniform, the Civilian Conservation Corps, where he learned that a hot meal at the right time can end a fistfight quicker than a sergeant major. Sato asked about portions, and Red gave numbers that sounded like confidence: patties per man, ounces of coffee per cup, slices per loaf, minutes to a full cycle when the stove ran right. Paper met experience without quarrel. The cooks grinned because numbers were something you could beat with practice. Tanaka did not grin. He counted the same numbers and arrived at a separate truth. A system that could standardize mercy at scale could standardize violence at scale too. The only difference was intention. Clouds gathered without promise of relief. Heat lay on the yard like a thick order. The range breathed evenly. The coffee kept its tremor without boiling over. The bun boxes released steam as if exhaling. Red's crew ran the choreography until it looked like instinct. Sato jotted a final note. Procedure is character under pressure. The guard sergeant checked his watch. Somewhere, far beyond the valley, ships loaded, planes lifted, bottling plants filled glass at a rate that would have sounded like science fiction 10 years earlier. The stove gave a small, satisfied tick as someone wrapped a pan flat. Red looked up only long enough to see the line steady and the sky holding. He didn't need to say anything. The range said it for him every time the flame steadied after a turn of the valve. The rulebook had teeth because ordinary men bit down on it and did not let go. The road into the gulch was red and rutted, but the trucks didn't seem to care. The first CCKW came in low, gears talking, its canvas top dark with island dust. The second followed at patient distance, heavy with glass and ice, bottles chiming inside their slats like cautious bells. Red stepped off the loading dock with a clipboard while a corporal signalled ground. The air smelled of wet iron and old sugar. The lead driver, helmet pushed back, forearm sunburnt to cord, climbed down and thumped the fender like he trusted it. "Depot says you're good for 2 days, Sergeant," he said. Red signed, checking the meat by feel and the flour by habit. The CCKW's straight six ticked as it cooled, the sound of a faithful machine remembering motion. 5,000 pounds off-road isn't a metaphor when you hear it arrive. It's survival delivered on time. The second truck inched too far into the soft and sank to the axle. The driver cursed once and stopped because cursing doesn't move steel. He set a chock and waved the first truck around. The winch cable spooled out with a rasp like a giant zipper. Hooks met eyes, mud squelched. The line went bar taut and then sang. The stuck truck shivered, rose and crept forward until the ruts quit arguing. Red didn't smile, but the corner of his mouth admitted a truth. Redundancy is a kind of mercy. Sato stood clear, counting intervals. He timed the offload against the mess line's tempo, calculated how many crates could be stacked without collapsing the flow, noted how long it took a corporal to inventory soft drinks against the paper sheet. He didn't need to guess at the broader picture. Depots at Pearl and Hickam fed this trickle. Ships fed the depots. Factories he'd never see fed the ships. Somewhere in that upstream current were men who wrote schedules with a pencil as blunt as a fist and still hit their marks. Tanaka watched the same ballet and heard a different music. He knew what it took to keep a forward company supplied with basics no civilian would call luxuries. He knew how often tomorrow never arrived when the convoy timetable lived on hope instead of steel. Here the timetable was indifferent and therefore reliable. If mercy could be planned to the minute, what else could be planned beyond the fence? Red moved crates onto dollies and into shade. Ice fogged the bottle glass, which answered sunlight with a soft hiss. He diverted one case to the canteen cage because rules demanded accounting, then slid the rest toward the mess like ammunition. The bun boxes breathed when he cracked their lids. The stove lifted a little when he fed it the new can. The line never lost the beat. He did not say good job because praise is a currency you spend only when it matters. He handed the driver a canteen cup instead, and the man drank like work itself had a taste. The corporal at the cage ticked off tobacco, candy, stationer's goods, soft drinks. Sato read the list with his eyes and with his temper. Soft drinks felt impossible until he remembered the arithmetic that underwrote the absurd. Bottles everywhere because bottling plants everywhere. The rumour said more than 60 would be operating before the war was out, a number that sounded like satire written by logistics men with a sense of humour. It was not satire. It was policy turned to plumbing. He jotted a quiet comparison out of habit. Crate flow here to sortie rates there. The rhythm of lunch to the rhythm of an airfield when the weather broke. Men who ate on time worked on time. Guards who drank cold without guilt treated their charges like regulations intended. Information rose like steam when fear dropped to a simmer. Tanaka filed the winch scene under distress and response. 2 trucks meant one mistake did not become a crisis. He thought of ship convoys that had left him counting distance with his teeth because the second ship never came. He thought of the message the Gulch would send through rumour whether the Americans intended it or not. A nation that rescues its stuck supply trucks before lunch will not starve at the front. Red finished the paperwork and put the pencil behind his ear. The trucks left the way they had come, the road swallowing their noise by degrees. The yard resettled into its original music. Stove breath, spatula taps, bottle chime, a canteen latch snapping shut with a practical finality that felt like a promise. Sato folded his notes and looked at the fence, already hearing the conversations the afternoon would make possible. Tanaka pressed his lips into a line that meant calculation, not anger. The Gulch smelled of grease, coffee, and a discipline that did not need to shout. The sun climbed another inch. The wire thrummed a single, satisfied note. Inside the kitchen, a private slapped a tray into perfect place, and the stove answered with its steady, loyal roar. After the line thinned, Sato sat at a field desk under patched canvas and laid his papers like a navigator charting shoals. He copied the phrase he trusted most: 3 abundant meals equal to the best food of the United States Army. A bureaucrat had written it about Sand Island, but the words fit this valley too. Abundant was not a soldier's adjective. It belonged to warehouses and ledgers. That was why it mattered. Abundance at scale is not an accident. It is a decision enforced by machines and men who keep them honest. He stacked today's timings and traced the arteries backward. Pearl Harbor depots yesterday. CCKWS at dawn. First truck meat and flour, second truck glass and ice. Winch, pull, recover, proceed. Range M 1937 tuned by ear until the flames note settled into that confident growl Red trusted. Canteen cage stocked to regulation. Tobacco, candy, stationery, soft drinks. Each element did its small part. Together they said something larger than kindness. They said the United States understood that mercy, standardized, becomes leverage. He reached for numbers that would sound like fiction if he hadn't seen their shadows in the yard. Aircraft production would climb toward 300,000 by war's end, while Japan's would stall near 76,000. Whole towns in America had refit themselves into factories that pushed wings and engines into the world the way cornfields once pushed harvests. Meanwhile, Coca-Cola's wartime footprint had bloomed into more than 60 overseas bottling plants, so a 5-cent drink could reach any GI, anywhere. One company's global map now looked suspiciously like a supply plan. The impossible statistic hung there with the clarity of a bell. An American soft drink network rivaled an empire's entire aircraft industry in sites and throughput. He did not write the comparison that lived beneath the numbers. A single bomber plant could outproduce an entire enemy nation's monthly total, and the men who made those bombers ate meat on their breaks. Today's sandwich in this gulch had been baked in the shade of that truth. He preferred not to gloat on paper. He let the numbers keep their quiet dignity, because dignity travels farther than taunts. Tanaka appeared at the fence, as composed as a man can look when the arithmetic is against him. He asked Sato in careful Japanese whether the stove ran on gasoline or magic. "Gasoline and tuning," Sato answered, and the officer's mouth tightened at the fairness of it. Tanaka confessed nothing else, not directly, but his eyes moved like a staff briefing. Trucks, crates, bread, coffee, ice. He was inventorying a humiliation that did not look like defeat until you put it all in one frame. Red tapped the gauge on a fuel can and nodded to his crew. "Change over now, not later." The flame dipped, shivered, and then steadied when the fresh can came online. The stove's single tick sounded like a lock releasing. He checked the bun boxes and the coffee and the waste bucket and found nothing to scold. The line would open again in an hour for work details coming off shift. Standards mean you never let the second meal shoulder the first's mistakes. Sato wrote the sentence he knew would anchor his memorandum. Humane abundance isn't charity. It is strategy that multiplies without firing a shot. The canteen sold soft drinks by rule. The mess met depot standards by rule. Inspectors arrived by rule. Prisoners noticed by nature. Rumour carried what memos could not. Men who believed surrender meant obliteration would learn a different grammar when the bottle hissed and the bread yielded. Not all would cooperate. Enough would. Rain threatened and then withheld itself. The gulch simmered. A private from the kitchen came to the desk and asked, with a seriousness that touched Sato more than a speech, whether the pan grate should be re-oiled or replaced. "Replace," Sato said without thinking, then smiled at his own presumption. Red didn't mind the interruption. He liked that the question existed. It meant the line would remain predictable. Predictable is the most merciful thing a system can be. Sato capped his pen and stacked his pages. He did not write about Takako's laugh or the bottle cap she had pocketed like a talisman. He wrote instead about intervals, inventories, inspection phrases, and the impossible scale that made them routine. When he finished, the stove exhaled, the bottle crates chimed once in the shade, and the gulch felt like a room where a long argument had finally found the correct word. Shade made its own diplomacy. After chow, the tarps breathed like sails, and the talk found its low human register. Sato took a stool that squeaked once and went still, pencil balanced, face blank the way instructors taught. Let the silence carry the weight. Let the witness step into it. He asked for the smallest truths first, how a swab tasted after 3 days without fresh water, how rice felt in the mouth when the cook had stretched it with barley. He did not write hunger, he wrote grams, bowls, the number of men to one pot, because numbers do not swagger. Across his shoulder, Red's crew sluiced the griddle with a rag and whispered about fuel cans with the respect artillerymen give powder. A petty officer offered a sketch of a convoy route the way a man offers a confession he does not name as such. He traced a line with a fingertip, paused over an inlet, and called it a place where engines lose heart. The mess line's afterglow had loosened his weathered face into a series of ordinary expressions: irritation at a pebble in the sandal, gratitude for bread, the cautious relief men feel when no one is shouting. Sato matched the calm with his own. He asked if the shipboard ration was measured by ladle or by cup. "Ladle," the man said, but the metal always scraped the bottom too soon. From the yard's edge, Tanaka watched the interviews played like chess at the speed of weather. He could see that Sato took nothing by force. The food did that part. He could also see the guard sergeant keeping a steady distance and an open eye, the balance between duty and decency held like a level tray. He swallowed around the truth he had already written in his hidden page. Mercy planned to the minute is a weapon that wounds no skin and breaks strong habits. Red inventoried what hunger had not destroyed: order. He had fewer disciplinary reports on days when the grill ran heavy and the coffee kept its tremor. A private who tended to pick quarrels when sugar ran out now picked up trays instead and stacked them into satisfying towers that stayed put. Red pretended not to notice, because noticing uses up air, and the stove needed it more. He did the math without drama: meat divided by head count, cups by urn capacity, minutes per cycle spiraled against weather. The line kept time. Sato thanked a sailor for a detail about a quartermaster's joke, how the man had called barley stretchers and then stopped laughing after the second week. It was not a secret of war, but it was a measure of morale, and morale shifts the mass of armies. He wrote it down with the same pressure he used for coordinates. He asked the sailor what he thought of American coffee and received a technical answer: strong enough to taste after a cigarette, not bitter. He logged that too. A gust pushed dust and voices under the tarp. The stove, 20 yards away, exhaled and resumed its loyal growl. Sato made a decision he had delayed. He would title his memorandum "Mercy at Scale," not because it sounded noble, but because it described the mechanism of the day. A camp that met depot standards by rule had turned the mess line into a hinge on which conversations swung. He did not confuse cause and effect. He let them hold hands. Tanaka drifted closer without admitting intent. He asked Sato in a tone that passed for casual how often inspections occurred. Sato answered with a calendar logic: regularly enough to require habits, unpredictably enough to punish shortcuts. Tanaka nodded once. He understood habits. He also understood what happens when a system does not possess the resources to demand them. Red signed a requisition for more scrub brushes and felt better than he had after any praise. The brushes would show up, men would do their part, the range would take care of business if you fed it and listened. He thought, but did not say, that his country's promise had to live here where steel met fat and fire without anyone reciting it. He slid a tray into place, and it rang true. Sato closed his notebook with a sound like a well-made door and stood. He would not push further today. The conversations would be there tomorrow because the stove would be there tomorrow, because the trucks would be there tomorrow, because the depots would be there tomorrow. He gave a short bow that respected rank without abdicating judgment, then stepped back into the sun where the wire sang its single stubborn note. Tanaka waited until the shade moved and the yard emptied to open his notebook. He wrote standing back to the fence, the way a man writes a last letter without admitting its finality. He put today's lunch into units he trusted: trays to men, patties to pounds, bottles to crates, crates to trucks, trucks to hours. He let the numbers pile and refused to translate them into humiliation until they did the translating for him. He had once reduced a coastline to lines on a staff map and told a captain where to land Marines. Now he reduced a stove to a doctrine he could not defeat. He put scarcity on the facing page, the arithmetic of his life. Rations aboard transports that came late and left early. Barley used as honesty and lie at once. Honesty because it added volume, lie because it did not add strength. Kerosines measured like medicine. Convoy tables that were wishes stapled to weather. He gave scarcity its full marks. He did not pretend it had not produced courage. He knew boys who ran boats into gunfire with a serenity that would shame saints. He did not put their names in this book. He put their hunger. Across the yard, Red's crew moved to maintenance, which struck Tanaka like a parable. Equipment cleaned before failure meant tomorrow's meal would be as predictable as today's. Predictable is a quality war erases in nations that cannot afford bulk, redundancy, training time, spare parts, or patience. He had told young officers that surprise was an ally. He saw now that surprise had been forced on them by poverty disguised as audacity. He wrote the sentence he had tried to avoid. A nation that can standardize mercy can standardize everything else. He did not mean softness, he meant process. He had watched the winch pull a stuck truck without a speech. He had watched a corporal recite canteen stock like a liturgy. He had watched a stove breathe on schedule. He could not call that decadence. He could only call it depth. There was room in the book for memory he wished would rot, but memory respects no orders. He wrote about a small pier on a small island where a shipment of rice had not arrived. He wrote about the way men do math with eyes when told to split one bag 3 ways. He wrote about a captain who shared his portion until his face hollowed and his temper sharpened. He wrote how shame sat like a stone in the throat, how ideology wrapped the stone in silk and called it honour, how the silk strangled men as politely as a handshake. He forced himself to look again at the valley in front of him, trucks, crates, bread boxes breathing steam, a range that never missed time. A guard sergeant whose discipline felt like a loan the system could afford to extend without charging interest. He measured all of it against a conviction he had carried since academy days, that will outruns matter. He found matter had not run out. He allowed 1 page to break form. He wrote, not with numbers, but with a sentence. We are outproduced to the point they can feed us like themselves. He did not add the implied clause, and therefore they can destroy us at a scale we cannot imagine, because imagination was not short in him. He folded the page twice and slid it into his boot, where sweat would blur it into a secret even he might not be able to read later. The truth did not require legibility to persist. A breeze stood the hair along his forearms. He closed the book and breathed through the tightness in his throat that had nothing to do with carbonation. Honour had not left him. It had changed shape. It would no longer be the refusal to bend. It might become the refusal to lie to himself about what he had seen. He straightened his collar out of reflex and walked the fence once, like a sentry who believes the act itself matters. The stove ticked as someone set a pot back on a trivet. Tanaka counted the ticks and thought, not for the first time, that you could time a nation by the calm of its machinery. He did not look back when he moved toward the barracks. He did not need to. The sound followed, equal to the hour. The first drop hit like a coin on a drum, then a dozen, then a sheet. Corrugated roofs rattled under the squall, and the valley's red dust liquefied into slick clay that grabbed at boots and good intentions. The stove breathed through it, flame tucked low and sure as a heartbeat. Red didn't raise his voice. He gave signals with his hands, gloves on, trays in, door shut, and the crew answered with the competent silence of men who had learned not to argue with weather. Coffee held its tremor. The bun boxes exhaled like sleeping animals. Lightning cracked somewhere to the west, and radios coughed into stutters. For a minute, the range's growl became the only reliable sound in the yard. Sato stood under a sagging tarp and watched how a system tilts to meet pressure without changing its posture. Guards shifted men from the open to the covered spaces with the brisk courtesy of ferry captains. The canteen cage slammed once and then reopened when somebody remembered that routine was itself a kind of shelter. Bottles chimed in sympathy to thunder. The inspector came hunched against the rain, notebook hooded by a case that knew oceans. He shook himself like a dog and produced the same checklists that had embarrassed men on 2 continents into conscience. He did not dramatize food. He weighed it. He did not applaud coffee. He tasted, compared, wrote. Sato watched the small ritual with affection he would never confess. Bureaucracy gets mistaken for indifference. In storms, it becomes a spine. Tanaka stood at the wire, face steady, hair plastered to his forehead. He could not hear words, only rhythms. The rhythm said nothing had broken. Trucks would slither, and men would swear, and the line would hold because the line had reserves of time and fuel and will baked into it. He thought of ships trying to unload while a swell lifted cargo nets 6 feet beyond the reach of men with poles and hope. He thought how often hope had been their only reserve. Somewhere between thunderclaps, an impossible number rose in Sato's mind like surfacing truth. There were months, this very year, when a single American plane factory would turn out more aircraft than an entire island empire could manage in the same period. He did not need to write the number for it to change the air. He looked at the stove and moved the thought sideways. What becomes of men who can build weapons and still find time to build bottling lines enough to make a valley hiss with cold while a storm beats its roofs? The answer lived in the way Red's crew smiled with their mouths shut when the flame steadied after fuel change. The squall passed as abruptly as it had landed. Water streamed off the eaves in clean ropes, and the wire sang a new, brighter note. The inspector snapped his book closed and shook Red's hand the way men do when they cannot praise but would like to. Red nodded once and returned to the gauge because the second meal did not care about compliments. Sato wrote 3 words, abundant, consistent, inspected, and let the storm wash the rest. When the sun tore a hole in the clouds, steam rose from the red ground in sheets. The stove's tick-tick as cooling metal settled sounded like someone counting breaths. Men came out from shelter with the stiff politeness weather imposes. A corporal at the canteen cage wiped each bottle before handing it across the sill, more for habit than for need. Takako stood under the edge of a roof where drops could not quite reach and watched light find the yard again. She did not think of doctrine, she thought of dry socks. Red cut the burner and the silence laid itself out over the valley in a single clean piece. For a long second, no one spoke. Then a fly rediscovered ambition and the mess resumed the ordinary procedure that makes armies possible. Sato closed his hand around his opener as if it were a lucky coin and stepped into the brightness that follows storms. Tanaka blinked. Once, in relief, he did not permit his mouth. The gulch returned to its hum with the calm of a nation that knows its machines will be ready when the sky changes its mind. Night pushed the edges of the camp inward until the stove's residual warmth felt like a small hearth against a too big dark. Sato took his place at the field desk with a pencil worn to a stub and a stack of papers that smelled faintly of onions and rain. He arranged facts on the page the way a quartermaster arranges crates, heavy first, fragile on top, everything strapped to keep from shifting under motion. He began with the phrase the inspector's predecessors had used with such careful understatement. 3 abundant meals, equal to the best food of the United States Army. He wrote it as a heading because headings teach readers where to look. He mapped the day backward with lines and arrows, depot to truck to stove to cup to mouth. He added the canteen because the cage had chimed throughout, a bell choir announcing doctrine. He sketched the winch's arc, and the moment the stuck truck rose because redundancy is a diagram as much as it is an attitude. He did not need to gild what had occurred. He needed only to let the line show its own inevitability. Mercy that arrives on time is not sentimental. It is an operation. On a fresh page, he set the production curves side by side like competing terrain features. American aircraft would crest near 300,000 by war's end. Japanese output would stall around 76,000. He did not celebrate. He correlated. High curves correlate to steady rations, to spare trucks, to inspectors who can afford to be unpopular, to kitchens that never miss a cycle. He added the unmilitary but decisive figure of bottling plants, more than 60 overseas facilities by 45, because morale moves on its own logistics. He let the number sit without exclamation. The exclamation belonged to the stove's even breath. He quoted Article 11 exactly, then translated its spirit into the day's images: a bun box exhaling, a corporal reading canteen stock like a prayer, a guard who treated a civilian internee as a human because the regulation made it normal and habit made it easy. He included small data: minutes between trucks, ounces per cup, incident logs lighter on heavy meal days. He allowed himself one sentence of theory: humane abundance accelerates the erosion of enemy ideology without raising a hand. He crossed out accelerates and wrote hastens because haste and speed were not the same. Tanaka's shadow crossed the paper at one point and did not linger. Sato did not look up. He was not hiding the work. He was respecting the boundary that let both men keep what dignity the day had left. He did, however, write a line he would not attribute. A nation that can spare cold and sugar for enemies has already answered the question of tomorrow's offensive tempo. He underlined tomorrow once. There was a convoy's worth of meaning in it. He added the stove's designation wherever a reader might miss it: Range, Field M, 1937, so that future officers, reading quickly, would know the gear that made the argument visible. He included the truck's model so the same readers could see and hear them in their minds: CCKW 2.5, 5,000 pounds off-road, the faithful tick of a straight 6 cooling in the evening. He put the inspector's phrasing in quotation marks because quotation gives a sentence the soldier's virtue of accountability. By the time the pencil met wood, the camp had quieted into the kind of hush that pretends it will last. Sato stacked the pages square and bound them under a clip like a platoon squared away for inspection. He wrote a final paragraph that did not name Takako or the laugh she allowed herself when the bottle surprised her. He wrote instead that in the hot valley of a Pacific island, procedure had done what sermons could not. It had made decency predictable and therefore powerful. He blew grit off the top sheet and felt against all training a small pride. He slid the memorandum into a folder with a name that would look dull in a file: Effects of standardized rations on prisoner cooperation and intelligence yield. The duller the name, the safer the insight. He stood and stretched and heard the stove tick once like a rifle cooling on a range after qualification. He left the desk lamp burning for a minute to pretend someone was still working while he walked into the night. Weeks turned the gulch into a machine that forgot how to fail. The mess line ran like a good clock. The guard shifts folded into each other with no seams to catch fingers. The canteen cage opened on schedule and closed without argument. Men stopped bracing for the crash that never came. Red still checked gauges as if disaster were a shy animal that needed coaxing, but the range obeyed like a loyal mule. The rumour net did its own work. Prisoners told each other that meals arrived like sunrise and inspections like mail. Discipline grew not from fear, but from boredom, which is the safest soil an army can plant. Sato gathered the after-action pieces his memorandum had asked the system to notice. Interrogation yields upticked on a scale that would never make movie posters, but would make operations hum. A unit designation offered without prompting. A convoy schedule mentioned because the speaker forgot he was supposed to be vague. A sketch of a cove that saved an hour of scouting. He filed the incidents under the same 2 words over and over, post-meal, and let repetition become argument. He wrote fewer adjectives. He needed none. Takako's world changed shape by increments. She folded laundry that smelled of soap instead of fear, mended a sleeve with thread the quartermaster had issued without ceremony, and learned the kitchen's rhythms by ear. She still flinched at loud voices out of habit, but there were fewer of those. She kept the first bottle cap in a cloth pouch and did not show it to anyone. It was not a fetish. It was a hinge. On laundry days, she stood downwind of the stove long enough to let the smell of onions push against memory. She did not forgive. She filed. Tanaka's face lost its pinched exhaustion. His notebooks grew neater and less frantic, then deliberate. He stopped writing about scarcity as destiny. He began writing about scarcity as condition. Condition you can plan around. Destiny you can only serve and die under. He returned the small bottle cap he had picked off the ground to a younger prisoner who had been eyeing it like the memory of a world he might survive to see again. He did it with the invisible grace of men who have decided to stop being cruel to themselves. Red's report log told a story he didn't sweeten. Fewer fights at the fence, more trays stacked right side up in the drying rack without supervision. A corporal who had needed counselling twice for temper now needed it not at all. Red did not pretend food had done all the work. Guards learned, inspectors enforced, officers modelled. But he did believe calories had recruited order onto the American side, where it belonged. He told a new cook that the range was a weapon that fired comfort instead of lead, and the boy believed him, which was satisfying. Sato revisited his memo's claims with a critic's eye. He found places where he had been charitable and was pleased to see the data catching up rather than falling away. He penciled in a marginal note on rumour's tempo. Word of treatment had travelled faster than he had guessed beyond the wire, which meant fresh prisoners arrived more inclined to believe the mess line would hold. Belief is a logistical commodity like any other. You can squander it or invest it. The camp had accidentally bought low and was now selling high in the currency of cooperation. The guard sergeant, who kept to himself and his watch like a monk, began to say good morning without sounding like he was reciting a rule. He nodded to Takako once when she stepped aside to let a dolly pass, and she nodded back as if she were living in a city again and had bumped shoulders with a stranger on a street. Red saw it and pretended not to. Sato saw it and made a note with no words, because some facts belong only to memory or to fiction. Afternoons ran without thunder for a while, but the stove's tick stayed in the air like a metronome men can feel after the orchestra has gone silent. It was easy, watching the gulch work, to forget there was a war beyond the ridge. Then a convoy growl would float in from the road and the trucks would arrive and everyone would remember what system put bread into hands and order into minds. The range breathed on. The hour turned. The camp did not change its mind. Grass took back the yard slowly after the war, as if it respected the discipline it was erasing. The wire came down in sections that left pale scars on posts. The stove went quiet, and then away to storage, and then to auction, and then to a farmer who baked pies on Sundays. Red, older by a notch and steadier by two, taught young cooks stateside that a range is a promise you either keep or break with every ladle. He never used the word doctrine in class. He used the word habit. Habits win wars you never see on maps. Sato's memorandum moved through channels the way useful things do when they wear dull coats. It became a paragraph in a manual and then a footnote in a lecture and then an assumption in a course where new officers were told that humane rations reduce incidents and increase yields, full stop. He did not chase credit. He folded his copy into a desk drawer and put a bottle opener on top of it, a paperweight that meant more than any coin. When he read the paper years later, he winced at a sentence or two that sounded eager, then forgave his younger self for wanting truth to arrive on time. Takako built a small life in a quiet place where rice cooked without anxiety and bread was not a miracle. She married a man who carved wood with patience and ran his thumb along the grain in the evenings like a prayer. She never acquired a taste for the drink that had startled her in the gulch, but she kept the cap in its pouch, a reminder that shock can be a bridge if you do not burn it. When children asked about the war, she told them she had eaten a sandwich that changed the weather inside her. She left it there. Stories must be sized to the listener. Tanaka lived long enough to see maps bleed into new colours under different flags. He taught navigation at a school that was no longer a barracks with chalkboards. He put the day's page, the one with the sentence he had not wanted to write, into a book he kept near his desk, spine cracked open to the place where sweat had blurred the words into ghosts. He told young men that honour begins with telling yourself the truth. He did not talk about bread. He did not need to. He smelled it sometimes in memory, and that was enough. Numbers do not age. They keep meaning when men who wrote them forget. The impossible statistic that had hung in Sato's head during the storm became a museum placard for tourists who mistook abundance for luck. In peak months, a single American plant produced more aircraft than an entire enemy nation could manage. The text did not mention a stove in a Hawaiian gulch, but the two facts lived in the same house. A country that can build the sky can feed the stranger at the wire. That is not sentiment, that is system. The gulch at Honolulu settled into its own kind of peace. Wind ran its hand through grass. Birds used the posts for gossip. The sun made the corrugated roofs, now scattered, look like broken scales. If you stood still, you could hear no echo of the stove, and then, faint as a watch tick from another room, you could. It was in the habit of men who keep faith with rules no one is checking anymore. It was in the way a crate is stacked without wobble, a bun warmed without burning, a cup filled to the line. Red visited once and did not linger. He touched a post, nodded to the air, and left without telling anyone. Sato did not come back. He preferred to let the memory hold its own light. Takako sent a letter to a friend with a pressed flower inside and the bottle cap wrapped in tissue. She asked that it be kept and not displayed. Tanaka stood on a ridge years later and faced west until the light failed. He did not say goodbye. He had already said what mattered to himself, in a valley where a range had breathed like a living thing and men had chosen to be decent because their country had given them the means. At dusk, the air went purple the way it does when the island holds heat like a secret. Somewhere, beyond sight, a long-cooled stove ticked in memory. Somewhere a cap hissed as if pressure were equalizing. That is what victory sounds like when the guns are done.